So this video is on homeostasis, a particularly important part of understanding how organisms operate, and a key part of this course. So the introduction to this is really quite simple. Excuse the low-res image here, but basically all multicellular organisms operate in conditions where the organism itself has to maintain what's called tolerance limits. So inside the organism, the internal temperature, chemical composition, and state of disorder, which is what entropy refers to, is low. So each of those things need to be maintained in a certain way, which is quite different to the external environment, which will have a different temperature, chemical composition, and tends to have high levels of disorder, entropy being high. So for an organism to function, it has to maintain order uh, against continuing tide of disorder that exists in the universe. And so in order to do that, it needs to be able to do a whole lot of chemical reactions within its cells that maintain levels of energy, chemical composition, temperature, and things like that. And so we create a state where organisms need to detect changes in the internal and external environment and respond to those. And that's what homeostasis is all about, is about detecting those changes, responding to them in order to keep within tolerance limits. So that can be represented by a graph and diagram here. So if we imagine this as being some sort of range of something, whether it's temperature or chemical composition or whatever it may be, there are limits within which the organism is healthy. Outside of those limits, we might call that disease, or it's in a state where it needs to urgently correct or it could die. Um, and so organisms don't stay static within that. There is a range in which they move. But as they get towards that outer limit of, for instance, particularly high temperature or particularly low temperature, first of all, they need to be aware of that. So there needs to be some system to detect that change in the internal or external environment, and then also to then slow it down and turn it around, correct that. And again, that's what homeostasis is all about, keeping within the tolerance limits. So we can also think of this as a balance. So homeostasis is about maintaining a balance. So when there's some sort of imbalance, we're starting to head towards those edge of the tolerance limits. That imbalance is what we call a stimulus. So something starts the process, some sort of stimulus, whether this is increased internal body temperature, for example. That change needs to be detected by a receptor, and so the body, particularly the nervous system, has a whole lot of receptor organs that are there to receive information. So receptor is just something that receives information. We'll send that to some sort of control center. Now, sometimes that is the central control center, being the brain in the central nervous system, or it may be elsewhere in the body, but that's sent, what it says here, input sent via an afferent pathway. So that's just something that's going into the control center. And then there's an output from an efferent outgoing pathway to an effector. And again, an effector is just something that causes an effect. It does something. And that allows us to respond to change. So in the case of, for instance, that increased body temperature, gets sent to part of the central nervous system. The effector would then be something like a sweat gland that produces sweat that reduces body temperature, and the imbalance is corrected. So homeostasis operates by detecting a change, responding to that change, and then that response causes a correction in that original stimulus. So here's some of the ways in which that happens. So I mentioned those three key steps there. And so some examples might be receptors could be the sensory neurons in the skin that might be responding, or in the sense organs that respond to taste, touch, sound, sight, smell, all those sort of things. But there's also internal organs and other senses that are looking at blood pressure, temperature, hunger, thirst, balance. There's processing centers in the spinal cord, in the brainstem and cerebellum, the lower parts of the nervous system, and in the brain as well. And that these might send out signals to muscles that are attached to skeleton, or smooth muscles. So for instance, there are muscles that control the esophagus or your digestive system or your blood vessels that constrict and cause movement without being connected to bone. And also glands. So glands being parts of the endocrine system, the hormonal system, that can send out hormones to affect change as well. And we'll go into both the nervous system and the endocrine system in a later video. So the classic example that I used before about body temperature is a key one here, and shows what we call a negative feedback loop. So again, I talked about the body temperature being increased, and that sweat as a cooling mechanism will decrease the body temperature. And so that's why we call it a negative feedback loop. So you get a positive stimulus, and the feedback would be negative in order to oppose that stimulus. So too high temperature, the feedback will reduce temperature. And in the opposite way, if the temperature is too low, there'd be mechanisms like shivering that will increase. And again, even though you're increasing the temperature, you are opposing it. And so we call that a negative feedback. So whenever the feedback does the opposite of what the stimulus is, we call that a negative feedback loop.